Demystifying the World of Small Business Government Contracting, a conversation with Chelsea Meggitt of Collaborative Compositions. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hi, everyone. This is Mac Pierre-Louis. Welcome back to LMI Podcasts, where we talk about law and conflict resolutions with professionals and everyday people. And today I have a special guest, Chelsea Meggitt, who will be speaking about government contracts, something that I don't know too much about, but wanted to have her on to discuss a lot of what happens behind the scenes in that whole world. And so, Chelsea, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you so much for coming on. I know that in our talks pre-show, we were discussing how we might, tackle this subject, and I just wanted you to kind of give an overall view of what GovCon or government contracting is, how it impacts small businesses. But before we get there, we want to talk about you, who you are, a little bit about your backstory. So I'll give you the floor. I've listened to some of your other presentations that you've done on the internet, and so I'm fascinated by the topic. So I'm gonna see it as educational for me as well. I will showcase your book, Hey GovCon, Get Help, the federal government guide you didn't know you needed. I'll show that on the screen while you're speaking. But can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into the topic. Go ahead.
Sure. So I'm a small business federal contracting expert. I'm one of the few, if not fortunate to say that I grew up in government contracting. So this is something that runs in my blood. My parents, my family did it. They had a very successful woman-owned small business that did predominantly government contracting throughout their careers, and they gave me an opportunity to learn all the ins and outs of working in a small business and specifically working within a government contracting small business growing up. So I've come to be very familiar with the industry, the market, and how all of the ins and outs and all of the nuances that go into it work.
Yeah, and when you say nuances, I think that's an understatement because I had no
Yeah.
idea there were so many details and fine-tuned points that connect to working with the government as a contractor. So, kind of take us behind the scenes a little bit, and really, you gotta dumb it down for
Sure.
me personally. Give us the bird's eye view, the overview of where does this even come from? We just see people working with the government, but we never know how they got there. Can you just
Sure.
sort up that way?
Sure. So, it's funny that you mentioned that. It's, most small businesses and that are the lifeblood of the economy of the country, right? That they don't necessarily know that the government actually procures and buys what they're doing, whether it's services, whether it's products, whether it's, hardware, technology solutions. The government procures all of those things. It's interesting. They buy everything from large quantities of mozzarella cheese to support ultimately school lunch and other feeding education systems and other feeding requirements, all the way through dog herding and sheep herding services. All the way through weapons of mass destruction. So anything that you can think of, sort of anywhere in that sort of industry, you can think of the government buys it. So it's one of those sort of uncommon yet more common than you would think industries. And most folks aren't necessarily aware that if you're providing a product, a service, a solution, the government probably does buy it in some way, shape, or form. And it's just about understanding how they buy it, who buys it in the government, and how you can get involved. That tends to be the tougher part for entry.
Gotcha. So I think I saw the phrase government marketplace. Is that
Hmm.
the so where the government is a consumer in that aspect,
Yep.
and they're paying for a service that a private individual. So can you take us to this point? Is there private versus public? Can you
Yeah.
go ahead and break that down?
Yeah, so the we what we refer to as the private sector are is everything basically commercial. So anything that has never touched government contracting and things that are within what we refer to as industry. That's typically what we would consider the private sector. Now, the public sector is basically any government contracting. So federal, state, local, that's all considered public sector, and that's because public funds, your funds, my funds, tax dollars, things like that, go into paying for a lot of these contracts and paying for a lot of these contract actions. So there's that difference in that nuance between industries and marketplaces that you may have never even heard of the public sector marketplace if you've only worked with private entities before. So that's the sort of nuanced difference between those.
Can you give us any examples? And I don't know if you're like sworn to secrecy, by some of the
Oh,
things you
sure.
can share, but I love anecdotes and I love storytelling. And so it connects with people.
Yeah, sure. So, I've worked with lots and lots of companies from everything from providing real estate services, for instance. So, real estate is typically not something that you're going to think of the government procuring much of or having a need for because they've got all these big, marble buildings that are all
Yeah.
established. But the reality of the situation is that there's a definitive need for things like real estate services when you're relocating folks, when you're rehousing folks that may be transitioning from base to base, say
Mhm.
in a military service,
Yeah.
or they're being repositioned for a new service, a new job within a different service entity. You also think of things when, so for instance, say you call the National Park Service because you want to make a camping reservation. I love this example because it's
Yeah.
it's it's a good one. You want to go camping, you want to make a reservation at the National Park Service. There's a government contractor who operates that phone line. So you're
Got
talking to
it.
somebody who works technically for the government under contract. And they work for a private company, so they're getting paid by a private company who has won that contract to staff that phone service for the National Park Service and a variety of other hotlines that you may call throughout the federal government.
Okay. In that example, that government contractor who's manning the phones,
Mhm.
they would have gone through a bidding process.
Yep.
And typically, how long are we talking about and how costly is that process?
Oh, geez. Well, so that's where we get into some deeper topics
Yeah.
of discussion. Is
Yeah.
so in federal contracting, there's a book that's called the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which, for what it's worth, is going through a massive overhaul right now in
Yeah.
the current environment and the current landscape with the current administration. But that book is about 2,360-ish pages long. So 2,360 pages long, approximately, is the book of regulations for all of the federal government's contracting processes and practices. So you may come into contact with 10 pages of that. You may come into contact with the entire thing, depending on what sort of bid you're going after. But
Yeah.
those bids are typically released on an open source website called SAM.gov. It's the System for Award Management. And those things are typically, anywhere from 30. You typically have about 30 days to respond to an RF, or request for proposal, so a bid, and that ultimately can be awarded anytime, essentially anytime after that. Mostly, you're not going to see anything within the first 60-90 days. Oftentimes, they take that responses that they get from that request for proposals, they'll review them, they'll do some deeper digging in terms of understanding what the quality and consistency of those proposals that they received are. But it ultimately can vary anywhere between 12 and 24 months, even, to ultimately get that response back on whether or not you've won a government project. And it depends obviously on the size
Yeah.
and structure of the type of contract, but it's a pretty long cycle when you get into the government contracting realm. It tends to be a lot longer than the commercial realm.
Gotcha. So many questions, actually. So, SAM.gov, that's a website that
Yep.
you said System for Award what?
Management.
Management.
Mm.
Okay. So, so is this kind of like a hidden secret in
Oh
a way?
gosh.
Would you say, because I feel like this has just just been under my feet. I've never really known that this whole world exists. But you grew up in it because your
Yeah.
parents, you said, were literally, government
Yep.
contractors, right, at one
Hmm.
point in time. But how do you get the word out about all of this knowledge? And what
Yeah.
would you say? How do you, why is it such a secret that people don't know about?
Well, it's not necessarily a secret. It's just not necessarily easy.
Mm,
So if it was easy, everybody would do it, right? But ultimately, because it's not as easy as some other types of contracting, specifically within the private sector, there's rules that sort of govern the whole process. A lot of folks find that it's lesser known about because you're not going to hear it talked about on golf courses or at expensive meals or in holiday parties at the office typically, because there's very specific rules prohibiting that type of behavior with contracting officials in the government. They're prohibited from engaging in things that could create bias, right?
yeah,
So there's ultimately loads of free resources, which our tax dollars, yours and my tax dollars, they go to pay for these things that are meant to be that are put out there for educational purposes. So there's these things that every locale has. So within your county or within your area, there is an entity that's referred to as an apex accelerator. Now, they changed the name of these things as of recently, but they used to be called procurement technical assistance centers, and they are free, absolutely free educational resources that are manned and staffed by people that are very familiar with government contracting, whose job it is to provide advice, insights, guidance, structure throughout the process for those folks that are brand new, that have no concept of government contracting. They will get you involved in, they will get you familiar with what SAM.gov is and how you need to register with that as a first step to getting into government contracting. That's where all government contractors are registered in SAM.gov. And if you are unfamiliar with that process or going through it, there's actually some I would say there's a little bit of a cottage industry for folks that will charge you for that type of registration, that will come in and say, well, it's very hard, you need to pay us to do it. So watch out for those things, because
yeah,
you don't there's no cost to get involved in government contracting.
gotcha.
There's plenty of free resources. I mean, the cost is our tax dollars, but that's something that we're going to pay anyway. So we might as well leverage the resources that they're providing on that tax dollar behalf, right?
Yeah, well, you certainly know a lot about this, and
Mm-hmm.
again, your book, I'll give a little shout out to it again, called "Hey, Hey, GovCon, Get Help: The Federal Government Guide You Didn't Know You Needed." And this is for all the people out there who might be interested in
Yeah.
knowing more. Okay, so what about somebody in my audience, for example, a lawyer out there or media out there, somebody who might be interested because they have a service that
Mhm.
they can imagine could be used by the government to do something better or to help people's lives. And I know some specific examples where they might provide a mediation service to help assist with conflict resolution. So, can you speak a little bit to those kind of professionals?
Sure, sure. So it's interesting. There's quite a bit of, specifically right now within the environment, just due to the new administration, all of the incredible amounts of changes and the incredible pace that we're seeing these changes be made at. There's quite a bit more conflict arising between industry professionals and contractors and government than I think I've probably ever seen before. And things like that include like contract terminations. Say you've had a contract terminated and you feel like it was either unjust or unwarranted or unnecessary for them to terminate that contract. There's all sorts of room for legal support and some mediation support between that contractor and the government entity. Now, there's some other interesting things that have popped up that this just kind of very timely for this conversation. The Small Business Administration has actually opened up a hotline for cutting red tape. And their hotline is the premise is if you've been hampered by red tape in your government contracting journey, call the hotline and report that red tape, right?
Mm.
So who's going to be sort of supporting the mediation of those red tape items between the government and industry? It obviously has to come down to some sort of legal entity or some sort of mediation, and working those significant issues out between both entities is going to be a critical function. Another thing I would mention is that there's quite a lot of unfortunately, a lot of the contracts that have been terminated, many of those contractors are still waiting on payment. They're still waiting to get their reimbursement for work that they may have already done, and they're really not trying to cause offense. They're really not trying to ruin relationships with their government customers. So having a third party intermediary in that situation who can provide them some support and help them recover some of those funds that they might not have been paid yet, and help them sort of maintain the solvency of those relationships, those are absolutely areas in which I can foresee them being some demand for both mediation and legal support.
Gotcha. So speaking of relationships, well, when the government comes in and says, "Look, we're a new administration in town, and we're going to just start making cuts,"
Mhm.
um, I have enough knowledge about contract law where you can't just breach a contract and just cut it if it's still in existence, unless somebody's on their way out. But with all these cuts, it's inevitably going to create some tension, some bad blood. Could you speak to that? Not getting political, of course,
Sure.
but what's your assessment about the current environment that we do live in ever since the new administration has come in?
So there has been some major changes. Probably the most changes that I've ever seen in my time doing this and in my career, and the pace at which the changes are happening is quite unbelievable. It's very rapid,
Yeah.
and it's resulted in a lot of contract actions being terminated, and ultimately, when within the government, most contracts that have any sort of duration to them, over a year typically, or some cases even under a year, they do have a termination for cause or termination for convenience clause included in them. And in those cases where termination for convenience is the case, the government is the entity that decides what's convenient for them. And if you've had an agency that has been, their budget's been essentially wiped out, they've been reduced in force, or they've had most of their personnel either laid off or transferred, you're in a position where you're not having anybody answer phones anymore. You're in a position, you're kind of in the dark, right?
Mm.
And trying to figure out where your current contract, if you have one, where that stands. And other folks have just had notice of termination for convenience issued to them and been left wondering what the outcome of that is, and they're not as familiar with having an experience like that going forward. So there's been a lot of shakeup and a lot of sort of disturbances between those industry relationships that were formerly very solid. They'd spent, these industry members, contractors had spent years developing these relationships, only to have them gone in a day. And so it is a very tumultuous time right now that we're experiencing, and it is challenging to understand and to see through where the next opportunities might be. But
Mm.
all of that experience that you've gotten as a government contractor is useful across the board. So you can use that and leverage that experience with other agencies that might be less prone to having contracts terminated.
Yes. So, and so to start wrapping up, I think when people think of government contracts, and this is what I've always kind of assumed, and that is that it's a controversial topic. That you think about government, military, industrial complex. You hear these buzzwords. You hear about defense department, all that, and there might be controversy in some minds where there's nepotism or there's conflict of interest, where people are just trying to get into the government, contracting, gig, so to speak, to make money. Do you think that having been working in this,
Mhm.
for so many years, do you think that people's concerns are a little bit misguided, and that there are rules in place, there are protections in place, or that there can be some nefarious, back dealings done? What would you say to maybe put people's minds at ease a little bit?
Sure. I think that you can find pockets of nefarious backdealings in every industry, in every market. But
Yeah.
I would say that within government contracting, it is the I would say the most sustainable and probably one of the safest markets to get into, because it is so low risk when it comes to having those requirements, having all of the information that you need to find out about all of those requirements, and ultimately being able to provide responsive services for those requirements on an ongoing period and on an ongoing basis, then it's probably more transparent than any other industry that you're going to get into. So, and because it does have that, 2000 plus page rule book, it is very well guided and regulated. So you've got some process and some procedure in place to fall back on in case you feel like there's some nefarious actions happening under your guidance or under your watch.
Gotcha. Well, I wasn't too familiar with this whole world, but yesterday I did a deep dive into it after I read your bio, and I did some internet researching. So now I know more. And would you say that everything you've talked about today also applies to the state level as well?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So, like Texas, for example, where I'm at predominantly, if people wanted to get involved with state level government contracting, the work that you've done in the book that you've written would also help people do the same kind of thing, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, let you close us out with any other thoughts you would want to leave people with today, who might not know that much about contracting with the government, just like me.
Sure, sure. So that's kind of the beauty of the book. Is the book is intended to be a roadmap for folks who are brand new, folks that have experience, and folks that may have no concept of what government contracting is. And it really is intended to help guide you through the free resources, the resources that are paid, and those that are trusted, and give you a sense as to some of the challenges you might encounter, some of the obstacles that'll come up, and how to avoid some of those common grifters and the sort of carnival barkers that you might encounter, and how to save yourself some time, energy, and money going through the process of becoming a government contractor. And really is intended to guide folks on how to be successful, no matter where you're at in your government contracting journey.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chelsea Meggitt. I appreciate your time today on the Lawyers Mediators International podcast.
Thanks so much.
All right, guys, until next time, check out this video and more on lmipodcast.com. And I will put some of these clips on our socials pages. All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you.